I've said many times, I am a conservative voter. I have voted faithfully for Republicans since I could vote. But I got to tell you, I'm sick of watching the Republican Party act like it deserves loyalty that it simply does not earn. At some point, I believe conservative voters, and certainly I, have got to admit the truth here that the GOP has become way too comfortable, disappointing, and even betraying the very people who put them into office. Too many Republicans campaign like fighters, they govern like cowards, and then expect applause because, hey, at least they're not the Democrats. Well, that's not enough anymore. And this housing bill is another perfect example of why so many on the right are fed up. The Senate just passed the so-called 21st Century Road to Housing Act by a vote of 89-10. And conservatives ought to be asking one simple question. Why are Republicans suddenly helping Elizabeth Warren write housing policy and very progressive housing policy nonetheless? The bill passed on March 12th with overwhelming bipartisan, one could say uniparty support, and it's being sold as a big affordability fix, which that's another interesting paradox that we're in, where we are supposedly in a golden age economically, yet we have all these affordability problems, housing, gas, food, energy. But I digress. How can those two things happen at the same time? All right, never mind. Okay. Now, this is not some tiny housing tweak. This is a sweeping federal package. It speeds up some environmental reviews. It expands financing tools for affordable housing. It raises loan limits on federally backed multifamily mortgages. Think Section 8. It pushes factory-built and modular housing. It expands support for manufactured housing, changes how some housing grants can be used, and includes a Trump-backed restriction on large institutional investors buying certain single-family homes. Now, in other words, this is not Washington stepping back. This is Washington getting more involved in how housing gets financed, built, subsidized, and steered, and that goes right into your neighborhood. Now, yes, to be fair, supporters say that this is the point, that the bill cuts red tape. It modernizes old programs. It boosts supply and gives families a better shot at home ownership. That's the sales pitch: affordability, efficiency, and reform. And in a vacuum, some of those line items are just fine. But here's why I believe many conservatives hear this and roll their eyes. It's because we've seen this movie before. All right, for years, Republicans warned that Washington should not use housing policy to reshape communities from the top down. They warned about federal pressure on suburbs. They warned about bureaucrats sticking their fingers into local zoning, local development, local priorities. The GOP told us for years that local mattered, that markets mattered. They told us that conservatives were the last line of defense against centralized planning. And now they're standing shoulder to shoulder with Elizabeth Warren on a major housing bill and calling it reform. That's a letdown. And you need to understand this hands more power over your local neighborhoods to the federal government. And here's maybe a bigger issue. The housing debate keeps getting framed as though Americans' main problem is just that there are not enough houses. There's not enough supply, right? But that's too convenient because it lets politicians pretend that the answer is always more federal nudging, more subsidy, more intervention, more market manipulation. But the market is actually telling a more complicated story. Inventory has been rising. Listings have been rising. Pricing growth has cooled. Reuters reported this week that active inventory has been climbing and that the market has been loosening, even as many still argue the country remains underbuilt over the long run. That means the picture is not simply there are no homes. The picture is that prices, financing, and policy distortion have kept the market from clearing naturally. We're still coming down from our COVID high. And that's the part Republicans do not want to say out loud. The problem is not just supply. The problem is that the market is not being allowed to correct itself. And that's what I think makes this so frustrating, because a correction is not an evil thing, economically speaking. A correction is how bad pricing gets fixed. A correction is how fake value gets washed out. That would bring down inflation, by the way. A correction is how affordability actually comes back. A correction is how dollars stop getting torched by years of asset inflation and market distortion, but nobody in power wants to allow that. Why? Because corrections are politically painful. Because falling home values make voters nervous. Because major donors, asset holders, lenders, developers, and everyone whose net worth is tied up in inflated housing prices hates the idea of the market coming back down to earth. So instead, what do we get? Well, another bipartisan quote unquote solution, another federally managed rescue, another round of policies aimed at cushioning, stretching, and delaying the very correction that the market probably needs. They keep calling it housing reform, but a lot of what Washington really wants is price protection, and price protection for their favored donors. Let's be honest. And once you see that, the whole thing makes more sense. The bill is being pitched and sold to us as affordability policy, but in practice, it looks a lot like another attempt to prop up a distorted market without letting it reset. It keeps the machinery humming. It keeps Washington in the game. It keeps housing politically padded, as you know, midterms are coming up, right? And for conservative voters who actually believe in markets, local control and honest pricing, that's not reform, that is surrender. Because real conservatism used to understand something basic, that not every pain should be federalized. Not every downturn should be softened or bailed out, if you will, by Washington. And not every bubble should be subsidized until it becomes a crater. Sometimes the market has to correct. Sometimes inflated values have to come down. Sometimes the medicine tastes bad. But if you never let the system clear, you do not prevent pain. You just stock it up for later. You don't fix a housing bubble, for example, by wrapping it up in taxpayer-funded bubble wrap. And this is why people are so disgusted with the GOP, not because conservatism failed, but because Republicans keep refusing to govern like conservatives when it matters. They campaign on local control, then they centralize. They campaign on free markets, then they manage outcomes. They campaign on principle, then they fold, seemingly the second politics get too icky and squishy. That's not leadership, at least not to me. That's not conviction. That's not conservatism. That's a nervous middle manager, shaking in his red tie and boots and shiny shoes. Scripture has something to say about this kind of inconsistency. James 1:8 says, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And we've mentioned how Proverbs warns against false balances and dishonest measures. God cares about integrity. He cares about consistency. God cares about whether your words actually mean something, and that applies to politics and politicians too. If Republicans only oppose federal overreach when Democrats do it, they do not have principle. They only expose themselves as controlled opposition. If they only love markets when the market goes up, they do not believe in free enterprise. They believe in selective protection. And if they only defend local control until a national political agenda needs to be pushed through, then local control was never really the value. It was just the line they used when it was useful. If your principles disappear the second your side gets power, they were never principles at all. Here's one thing I can promise you on this program, Culture Crossroads, and everything that we post. We are principle above party. We are principle above president. I don't care what party the president is. Now, that's why this bill matters. It's not just about housing. It's about whether the Republican Party still has a core, which I very much doubt. And again, I say that as someone who votes fairly consistently Republican. Well, actually, specifically consistently Republican. But right now, too much of the GOP message is basically this. Sure, we broke our promises. We bent our principles. We helped grow federal power again. But hey, at least we're not the Democrats. I don't know about you, but I'm sick of voting for not the Democrat. I want to vote for a vision for America that can be lasting and enduring. Because what the GOP is offering is not a vision. It is not a message. It is not how you win people who are tired, who are angry, who are overworked and overtaxed and getting crushed by the cost of living. People want something real. They want leaders who mean what they say and a party who will actually govern on the things it campaigns on. They want someone anyone to be honest and just say that the market is distorted and correction is necessary and this is going to be difficult, but this time the juice is worth the squeeze. We want someone who will be honest and say local communities matter and that should be protected, and that Washington is not the cure for every crisis. But the GOP keeps blinking. And every time it blinks, more conservative voters stop believing. This is what erodes the conservative voting base. This is what keeps many conservative voters at home, particularly in midterms. This housing bill is not just another policy fight. It's a reminder that the Republican Party keeps asking us conservative voters to settle for less, to excuse more, and to clap harder for smaller and temporary policy victories. But a party that will not conserve local control, that will not conserve market discipline, and whose consistent character is not conserving much of anything. And sooner or later, conservative voters are going to stop asking whether the GOP can win and start asking whether the GOP itself is worth conserving. I want to remind you that you can find new episodes of Culture Crossroads every Sunday evening at 5 p.m. Central Time on the Beck News Network, BEK News Network. And you can find that at becktv.plus, BEKTV.plus. You can find new episodes there every Sunday at 5 p.m. Central, as well as our archives. And of course, you can find shorts, reels, daily commentaries, and other goodies right here on our YouTube channel at Culture Crossroads 316. That is at Culture Crossroads 316. For now, thank you for watching. Again, remember to like, share, subscribe, comment. We appreciate it. The channel is growing, and that is because of you. So we are glad that the message that we have is resonating with many of you out there. Again, thanks so much for watching.